When you hear the words the Dark Ages, what do you see? You probably see mud, you see gray skies, illiterate peasants, and a world that suddenly forgot everything the Greeks and Romans ever knew. You see a 1,000-year gap in human progress, a void between the fall of Rome and the light of the Renaissance. We've been taught that for 10 centuries, the lights of civilization simply went out. But here's the problem. The people living through it didn't call it the Dark Ages. They didn't think they were living in a void. In fact, if you could go back and tell a scholar in the year 800 that he was living in a dark time, he wouldn't just be offended, he'd be confused. Because for the people on the ground, the world wasn't getting darker, it was waking up in ways the Romans never could have imagined. The Dark Ages is one of the most successful branding campaigns in human history. It was a term coined in the 1330s by a double-threat poet and scholar named Petrarch. Petrarch was obsessed with the grandeur of ancient Rome. He looked around at his own time and decided that because people weren't writing Latin as elegantly as Cicero anymore, the entire world must be in a state of intellectual decay. He called it tenebrae, or shadows. He wasn't describing the quality of life, the technology, or the economy. He was describing a vibe. And that vibe stuck. For centuries, historians who were obsessed with the rebirth of the Renaissance leaned into this narrative. They needed a villain for their story of progress, and the medieval period was the perfect candidate. But when you actually look at the data, when you look at the archaeology and the records, the darkness starts to look remarkably bright. Think about the way we eat. If you were a Roman citizen, your agriculture was built on the backs of massive numbers of slaves, using light scratch plows designed for thin Mediterranean soil. When the Roman Empire collapsed, that system broke. But what replaced it wasn't a decline, it was a revolution. In the heart of these supposedly dark centuries, someone invented the heavy moldboard plow. It was a massive wheeled machine that could cut through the thick clay-rich soil of northern Europe. It didn't just scratch the surface, it turned the earth over. This changed everything. It required teams of oxen, which led to communal farming, which led to the structured village life that defined Europe for a millennium. Suddenly, land that the Romans thought was a swampy wasteland became the most productive farmland on earth. And then came the horse collar. It sounds small, but it was the steam engine of the Middle Ages. Before the 9th century, if you hitched a horse to a heavy load, the strap would press against its windpipe and choke it. The new padded collar shifted that weight to the horse's shoulders. A horse is 50% faster than an ox and has significantly more endurance. This invention alone effectively tripled the amount of power available to a farmer. Population shifted, trade routes expanded, and for the first time in history, Northern Europe had a massive surplus of food. But what about the uneducated part of the myth? We're told that after Rome fell, literacy vanished and people became superstitious and dull. In reality, the medieval period gave us the most important intellectual infrastructure in the modern world, the university. The universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford weren't built during the Renaissance. They were built in the 11th and 12th centuries. They were self-governing corporations of scholars that invented the very concept of a degree. They debated logic, law, and natural philosophy with a rigor that would make a modern grad student sweat. They didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they translated it, argued with it, and expanded it. And while Europe was supposedly in the dark, the rest of the world was experiencing a blindingly bright golden age. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom was the center of the world's intellectual life. While we call this period the Dark Ages in the West, Islamic scholars were inventing algebra, mapping the stars, and refining the scientific method. They were performing eye surgeries and building hospitals while the West was still figuring out its new plows. The dark part of the Dark Ages usually refers to the lack of written records compared to Rome, but dark shouldn't be confused with empty. Archaeologists are now finding that the 6th and 7th centuries were a time of incredible craftsmanship. We see it in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, in the intricate gold work and garnet inlaid jewelry that rivals anything made in the modern era. We see it in the construction of massive cathedrals, engineering marvels that push the limits of physics and stone to create spaces of light and height that seem impossible even today. We also have to talk about the concept of time. The Romans lived by the sun. When it went down, the day was over. But in the 13th century, medieval monks needed a way to track their prayer schedules more accurately than a sundial or a water clock could allow. So they invented the mechanical clock. The clock didn't just tell time, it changed the way humans perceived reality. It turned time into something that could be measured, divided, and sold. It was the birth of the modern world. It moved us away from the rhythm of nature and into the rhythm of the machine. That didn't happen in the enlightened Renaissance. It happened in the dark Middle Ages. So why do we cling to the myth? Because it makes us feel better about ourselves. We like to think of history as a straight line moving upward, a ladder of progress where we are always at the top. If we admit that the Dark Ages were actually a period of intense innovation, social restructuring, and artistic brilliance, then we have to admit that progress isn't a straight line. It's a series of peaks and valleys. It's a messy, complicated process of adaptation. The fall of Rome wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of a specific, centralized, slave-based system. What followed wasn't a void. It was a laboratory. It was a time when the rules of the ancient world were thrown out, and people were forced to find new ways to survive, new ways to pray, and new ways to think. We called it the Dark Ages because we lost the instructions for how to read their world. We stopped looking at their inventions and started looking only at their Latin grammar. We judged 1,000 years of human experience by the standards of the empire that came before them and the ego of the thinkers who came after them. When you look closely at the dark, you don't find a world of shadows. You find the invention of the lens and the spectacles. You find the birth of the parliamentary system and the development of musical notation and the creation of the first mechanical power sources like windmills and tidal mills. We didn't wake up in the Renaissance. We just turned on a different kind of light. We traded the decentralized, innovative, and deeply spiritual world of the Middle Ages for the centralized, secular, and industrial world of the modern era. The next time you hear someone dismiss a period of history as dark, ask yourself whose perspective you're seeing. For 300,000 years, humans lived in actual darkness every night. But the Dark Ages? That was 1,000 years of people building the foundation of everything you see around you today. They weren't waiting for the light to come back. They were busy making their own.